Hi, welcome to Quirky Queen's Journals. My name's Kirsten. So today I thought I would try to paint a little bit more realistically. This is a picture of my other half and my dog in Aberfoyle for a wee walk on the 2nd of January. So I am drawing this onto an Amazon brown paper bag, which is what I will be painting on. So I actually was quite happy with how the sketch turned out. Drawing, and especially figures and animals, is not something I do very often. I'm definitely more of an abstract painter. But do you know, I think I learned a lot doing this. Made me think more about where the light's coming from, and also about when you're making. I basically drew my husband and the dog from the feet up, so that I was looking at the shapes of them rather than thinking of them as a human and a dog. Although my husband wasn't overly happy about the size of his nose. But I did have to exaggerate it a bit to show that he was looking in the same direction as Shyla the dog was. So here I am painting in the background colours. And actually, I'd been reading about using the complementary colours as the background colours because it adds more depth and richness. So I paint it all in similar colours to what's in the photograph, and then in the next segment I'll come back and I'll paint over it again with the complementary colours. I did try and stick to a limited palette of indigo blue, hooker's green, cadmium red deep and yellow ochre. I did use a little bit of white and raw umber. Shyla is a black dog, and as much as I tried to avoid using black, I did have to use the raw umber and the indigo, and also for my husband's hood as well. Oh, raw sienna, that was the other colour. The colour most present on the page at the moment is raw sienna. I forgot all about it. Oh, anyway, do you know what was really hard that you don't... When you're doing the abstract painting, you kind of define the edges yourself, and you know where the lines and the shapes are going. And if something's not working, then I suppose subconsciously you rectify it by maybe changing the composition slightly. However, when you're painting more realistically, it's actually quite a lot of pressure, I felt, to try and stay, as close to the lines as possible. And I found it particularly difficult with Shyla the dog. I also think that it would have been easier to do this if I'd painted the landscape and then added my husband and Shyla the dog in afterwards, because I found that the join between him and the dog with the landscape was actually very difficult. So the way I paint abstract painting is, I suppose, the level of detail is being added in all the time as you progress, and each layer you're adding on top. Whereas with this and the way that I did it, all the layers were there at the start, and it was almost like fitting all the pieces in at the same time, and I found it really difficult. Do you know what's quite interesting here actually? Because I've painted in the actual colour and then I've went over it with a layer of the complementary colour, the page has become very neutral. And they do say that two complementary colours next to each other can look like a neutral from a distance. So it's actually really quite interesting to see that here. When I set out to do this as well, I was thinking of doing it as, you know, like a loose painting where it's more the suggestion of my husband and Shyla the dog. However, I did find myself, I got very, what's the opposite of loose? Very tight, very pedantic about it. And when I went to do, I mean, when you look at the trees and the snow and the path in the photograph, there's not a terrific amount of detail in it. But I really struggled with keeping it quite bland, I suppose, so that the focal point was more on the dog. Because I much prefer abstract painting, I definitely don't spend enough time painting more realistically, so I don't have enough experience of it, and some parts of it I wasn't quite sure what the proper way of doing something was. Even though I was trying to think, just do it my way, the way that I think, I think that posed quite a big barrier, just the lack of knowledge of what steps to take. One thing I was very happy about at the end though was the colour palette. I felt that the colours at the end were really quite rich actually, and that although it was a winter scene, I think that I'd managed to convey warmth in it, and I think that showed, because actually walking about in Aberfoyle, even though it was freezing temperatures, it was actually really warm because we were walking fast, we were walking up hills, and obviously as well we were wrapped up really well, and I think that comes across in the picture. Another thing that I noticed as well when I was out, that a lot of the snow had almost like a blue or purple tone to it, which I tried to use in this picture. I have used white with the blue because I thought the grey arms didn't really match in as well. I did find that I would go over areas again and again. Basically, I know that layering is good, but I did so many layers on this painting, and I'm really not sure that how much, you know, when is too many layers too many? And also, I think a lot of the layers I was putting on is because I was trying to create a certain look to it. So I wasn't doing it in a way to add into the previous layer. I was almost doing it as a way to mask the previous layer. So I'm hoping with experience though that you just get into a flow of what to really add in each layer. Do you know, I think that when I drew my husband and Shyla the dog, when I started from the feet up, it helped me look at it more as the shapes and the lines rather than as a person and a dog. And I think that when I've done the painting, I've more thought about this is trees, this is a path, snow, man, dog, whatever. And I haven't thought of it in the way of being like the different elements of art, like the value or, you know, the edge or whatever. I turned it upside down to be easier to reach because the photograph is an A4, which is about 8 by 10 inches. So the painting's bigger than that. So that's why I've turned it upside down. But I'm actually wondering if that would have helped me look at it more like the elements of art rather than as painting trees. I can't actually remember how I looked at it when I was painting it upside down. I think one of the things I found most difficult was knowing how much detail to put into something. So I know that the areas you want as your focal point and that are closer to the viewer's eye, if you like, should be a bit more sharper and have a bit more detail. And obviously there's a lot of trees in the background. So I tried to concentrate on the lights and the darks rather than what type of tree they were or, like what shape the leaves were or whatever. I just tried to purely look at the accents and the highlights to try and create the sort of forest in the background. Although you can see that the abstract artist in me has came into the room for a wee minute because I've drawn these great big kind of leafy plants and I don't know why. I think I was just hoping that it would come together. Now, I actually do like the forest area in the background. I think that it's looking really quite rich and it's certainly looking dense. And I think the yellow ochre and the hooker's green, or is that cadmium yellow? I think it's cadmium yellow and yellow ochre and hooker's green together the light is quite a vibrant light that's coming through. I do end up collaging over this, and part of me wishes I'd kept to just the acrylic painting for the forest because of that richness and the light that's coming through the trees. I'm going to watch some more basic acrylic painting tutorials on YouTube because I feel like being able to paint realistically with more knowledge and basically better techniques will help me with my abstract painting, because today, especially when I painted my husband and Shyla the dog, starting at the feet and working up, and the way that I was able to look at them, I think that if I could do that more in my abstract painting, that actually it will make me a better abstract artist. So I'm laying down some shadows just now, and actually this is one thing that was easier when you're using the reference photo for a realistic painting, is knowing where the light is coming from and seeing the shadows, because actually I don't know whether it's because the sun was so low with the time of year it is, but the shadows were actually going to the side and behind, but they were also quite short shadows. And that's something that if I wasn't using the photo to paint realistically with, that I would never have picked up on. So I'm also just trying to define the path a bit more by adding in some of the darker areas down the side. And that was a little bit of a rug that I was using, that I used to create texture on the jelly plate. I was hoping that it would all of a sudden make the path look like it had stones on it. It didn't work. Though the yellow ochre on top of that kind of, I think it's indigo blue and cadmium red mixture with the white, the yellow ochre on top of that is starting to add richness to the path, which I liked. So when I do revisit the kind of beginner's acrylic painting, like realistically, and when I revisit those tutorials on YouTube, one thing I will be looking at is the steps in the process, because I really am just repeating myself quite a lot. And whilst I do feel that does help add depth, it does add detail, I think a lot of the reason I was doing it is because I wasn't really sure how to progress. So I'm now collaging the path with tissue papers that I've either got brush strokes of paint or they've been underneath, paintings that I've been doing, or they're jelly prints. I'm putting kind of light brown coloured ones onto the path, with some darker ones round where the shadows should be. I do feel this did help add some texture and, a bit of variety to the path, just to make it a bit more interesting to look at, but not so much that it took away from the focal points. However, I did add the collage because I wasn't sure on what to do next. So I intended to just use acrylic paint. However, I have ended up doing mixed media because that's what I feel comfortable with. I kind of what I know how to use to my advantage. I also should have applied these with matte medium, but I used the Mod Podge because that's what I had on the table and I didn't actually think. I must have switched my brain off. So there's quite a glare that's come off where I've collaged. I do end up moving the lights on my desk so that the glare does become removed. So I am using the heat gun to just dry the Mod Podge to get moving a bit faster. I'm terrible at waiting, so I am. And then I'm using, now in my last video where I made abstract art, on the other side of that Amazon brown paper bag, I had painted in white and then I'd put tissue paper and down on top of it while it was still wet to remove some of the white paint. Now, this tissue paper is what I'm using for the snow, and because I'd etched lines into the paint before I'd lifted it off, it's actually given really nice textures and spaces in the white painted areas, which I think the collage in this case for the snow, it wasn't just about, finding a way to do it. I actually think that the collage paper worked better than the paint would have in this situation. And if I was to do this again, I would definitely use that white tissue paper in the way that I'd used it here. So I've put some of the indigo blue thinned out with Mod Podge on top to create a bit of a blue glaze. It's a bit heavier than I would have liked. However, I just add on some more little bits of the white painted tissue paper, and I think the combination of the blue glaze in with some of the white on top of it actually worked really well together. I'm kind of glad I stuck to the blue and didn't go for the purple though, because I was getting a wee bit confused with my colour combinations because I was using the blue and the oranges and the purples and the yellow and the green with the red as well. I had a bit of everything going on. So one thing I did try to do was So, for example, the red part of my husband's jacket, I thought to myself, let's try and use the complementary colour green to create the shadows with. But it didn't really work. And then I remembered, well, actually, the two complementary colours next to each other makes things neutral. And I do find that when I did that, I lost a lot of brightness out of the jacket and the hat especially. And so that was a good learning curve actually, to be... It's good to try new things, but also to kind of think more about what it is that actually happens when you do use the complementary colours together. Like, it's quite strange to think of that they're so opposite, but at the same time, when they're right next to each other, they're also can be neutralise themselves. However, using them as an underpainting adds depth and richness to the painting. So they have relationships where they work really well together, and maybe circumstances where they don't. So I've just sticking an extra bit of collage on there because there was a bit of brown collage that had been used, but it wasn't the same shade or texture that any of the other rest of the path had been made up from. Poor Shyla, she's lost her head completely here. So I'm just sticking snow pieces down onto the path and the kind of grass between the fully covered snow areas, just to try and bring it together a bit more. And next I'm just going to add some more glazing to the path, just to try and blend the collages and the snow area and the path together. I think that's one thing as well. I feel like I used to be able to blend acrylic paints really well, and I think I'm so out of practice that I don't know whether or not I'm being too impatient with them. I'm actually quite excited to go back to basics because it'll be interesting to go through the fundamentals again with kind of some of the more advanced skills that I've picked up along the way. So I've just cut the edges off the painting to tidy it up a wee bit to give me a better idea of how the path in snow is looking. So I did mean to record this bit. I used some of my IKEA furniture packaging to create these lines. I used Hooker's green and cadmium yellow mixed together to create these couple of shades, and they're just sort of lines, and the idea was to try and help give the highlights and the accents to give them more depth. But because some of it's horizontal and some of it's vertical, the collage actually was quite clunky and cumbersome, and it didn't really do the job. So what I end up doing is putting... Can you still call it a glaze if it's quite heavy? I mean, I'm basically overpainting it to try and cover up the edges of the collage more. So I do regret adding in the forest collage. I think that the forest did look much better just being the acrylic paint. I've actually just added in full sheets of the tissue paper now to cover up the edges that are there. But it's fine anyway, it's all practice, and it was more about the man and the dog, my husband and Shyla. And it's also really shown me where some big gaps in my techniques lie, so it's been really good for that as well. And also the fact drawing the figure and the dog from the feet up, and how that allowed me to look at people and animals differently from a drawing perspective. That was really really helpful. So I'm using a colour shaper, which is basically like a silicone wedge instead of a paintbrush, to try and just bring the colour of the trousers back to have less highlights and accents in it. Because the colour, the way that I'd done them, I feel like the actual highlights looked more like a pattern. Now, I love the brightness of the cadmium red in the jacket here, and unfortunately I do lose that. However, it is interesting to see how bright the paintings can become, and I'm just trying to work out how. I mean, I have put Mod Podge in with the acrylic paints to add vibrancy to them, but there was something about the jacket that the red, and it happens in the hat as well, it just becomes very vibrant. I'll need to think about that more, how I managed that, and then how to actually keep it. I did watch a YouTube video before, and I think it was called Rembrandt for Kids or something, and it talked about how he managed to, in the old masters, how he managed to create such a contrast between the highlights and the accents. And there was a way that he did it that the person doing the video talked about, and I will need to find it again and watch it and then link it or tell you what the answer was. So I do end up getting out some chalk pastels and some oil pastels to try and fix what's going wrong in my painting of my husband. Personally, I blame the subject matter. So here it is. I've made these trousers look very camouflaged. So part of me likes it because it's quite, it's quite modern, and it's, there is a good contrast between the shadows and the light, especially here on the jacket. But I don't know what it is. There's something about, I'm struggling to blend. I'm struggling to work with the landscape and the figure and dog at the same time. I think if it was my husband and the dog on a blank background, that I would have coped with this much better. So the painting is nearly finished. What I'm trying to do now, I think, is I'm just trying to minimise the contrasts to make it feel more finished, I think. My poor dog, do you know what? She started off looking really good, and she's just became... Her poor face, I don't know what it is, but I couldn't get her face shape back. And my husband ends up with... He looks like he's wearing a big puffer jacket. So in my head, it's kind of about creating contrasts and then sort of bringing them together. I think that is the approach that I kind of take with it. But I think that the contrasts as well like where it was before I started adding in the white shading. I think that at that stage is where I liked it the best. Although I suppose that they do fit in better with the landscape now, and it is a bit more realistic looking. Maybe not quite the same clothes or dog that's in the photo, but more realistic looking as clothes and a dog in general. So there was parts of this I really enjoyed. I actually really enjoyed painting my husband and the dog. I didn't enjoy doing the landscape as much, whereas if I'd been doing the landscape on its own, I would have enjoyed that part of it as well. I think it's actually bringing the different types together into the one picture. It's actually much more complex. And when you do have gaps in your knowledge, then you're kind of fighting to save what you've done because you've invested a lot in it already, and you still want to do the best you can. So I am going to try, going over the basics again and then trying to do this again and seeing what the difference is. I am using a cotton bud here just to scratch out some of the paint, to let some of the complementary colour oil pastels show through. Just because I can't leave it alone and I always want it to look just a little bit different. I can't just settle for it looking normal. So I'm using the yellow ochre here just to fill in the path, and I really liked how this came across because the painting ended up actually like it became a really warm coloured painting despite the fact it was a winter's day. And I think the abstract artist in me liked that because I do like a bit of contradictions. So, painting a winter's day, but for it to be a warm painting really appeals to me. So, poor Shila's lost her foot. That's at the back. And I do add that in. You'll see it in the final picture. I don't think I added it in camera because I don't think I noticed. Oh, I never did get her back to being quite right, but that's okay. Overall, I'm quite pleased with it, but it was much more difficult than I anticipated that it would be. So I'm just doing some purple shadows just to kind of be complementary to the yellow ground and to match in with my husband's outfit. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon, and hopefully I'll be back with an upgraded version of this sometime soon.